Now that we've done a brief overview of the human body, we're going to start discussing our first body system, and that is the nervous system. The nervous system is made of specialized cells that are called neurons. So these cells have all the general cell structures that we've learned about way back at the beginning of the school year, but they have some unique structures that allow them to have very unique functions. So the nervous system has some very specific functions. Its role is to coordinate and control all body functions. So the nervous system is actually in charge of all the other body systems. And it works to maintain homeostasis in the body. The structures of the nervous system are the brain, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves. Nerve impulses are electrical messages that are carried through the body by the nervous system. These nerve impulses are how the nervous system communicates with the rest of the body. And nerve impulses are sometimes called action potentials. Neurons are the specialized cells of the nervous system. There are 3 different kinds of neurons. One type are called sensory neurons, and sensory neurons transmit impulses from the senses to the spinal cord and brain. So sensory neurons are giving our body information through our senses. Motor neurons transmit impulses from the brain and spinal cord to the body. So motor neurons are going to tell our body something to do. And interneurons transmit impulses between sensory and motor neurons. So the interneurons are going to connect the two, the sensory neurons that are going to the brain and the motor neurons that are coming from the brain. Neurons are amitotic, which means they do not divide. So the neurons that you have are the neurons that you have. Your body will not ever make more for you. Neurons also have very limited regeneration or very limited ability to heal. If the cell body remains intact, the axon is able to regenerate. So the cell body, we'll talk about in a minute, is the main part of the cell. So as long as that stays intact, the neuron may have the ability to heal some of the other parts of the cell. So we have sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons. So we're going to get into more detail on the anatomy of a neuron. What makes these cells unique and specialized compared to other cells in our body? So the neuron has a cell body. That is the main part of the cell that contains the nucleus, all the organelles we've learned about, and most of the cytoplasm. Dendrites are short little branching extensions that come off the cell body. There are many, many dendrites that are coming off of that cell body. The dendrites receive impulses. So think of the dendrites like little fingers that are grabbing impulses from its environment. The axon is the single long extension off of the cell body. So this would be like the long tail that it looks like a neuron has. The axon transmits impulses away from the cell body to another neuron. And the axon often ends in small swellings that are called axon terminals. Terminal means the end, and so the axon terminals would be at the end of the axon. So those are the small branches and swellings at the end of the axon. They release neurotransmitters, which are chemicals that help the body communicate. On the axon, we find the myelin sheathing. The myelin sheathing looks like beads, and these are bands of insulation on the axon. Their job is to speed the transmission of a nerve impulse. So the more myelin sheathing that the axon has, the faster it will be able to send a message. Nodes are the spaces between the myelin sheaths. And when the nerve impulses is being transferred through the nerve impulse actually jumps over the myelin sheath from node to node. So the more myelin sheathing, the faster the impulse can jump. So here's an example that shows how fast an impulse transmission can go when we have myelin sheathing. That would be the top image. And on the bottom, you can see that the impulse is transmitted much slower without the myelin sheathing. So now getting into neuron activity. How does the neuron actually send messages throughout the body? So one state of a neuron is called the resting potential. And the resting potential is when a neuron is doing just that, when the neuron is resting. It is not transmitting an impulse. When we have a neuron in the resting potential, the outside of the neuron is positive and the inside of the neuron is negative. When the neuron is transmitting an impulse, we say that the neuron is in the action potential. Remember, action potential is another way of saying the nerve impulse. The neuron receives and transmits a nerve impulse during the action potential. The impulse can be received from either another neuron or directly from the environment. And the impulse always travels from the dendrite through the cell body to the axon. So a neuron can only send information in one direction. When the neuron is transmitting an action potential, ions move in and out of the neuron as the impulse moves down the axon. The resting potential is reversed and then restored. So what that means is the axon is going to go from negative to positive, and then it's going to go back to negative once the impulse passes. A synapse is a space between neurons. The neurons do not touch one another. They're always separated by a small space called the synapse. So the synapse is where one neuron transfers an impulse action potential to another neuron. Sometimes the synapse is referred to as the synaptic cleft. So here you can see we have 3 neurons all separated by synapses. Neurotransmitters are chemicals which transmit an impulse across a synapse. Since the neurons are not physically touching one another, they need a method of transmitting the information from one neuron to another, and that's done by these chemicals called neurotransmitters. So for cells, for neurons to communicate, we have a presynaptic neuron. Pre means before, and so the presynaptic neuron is before the synapse. This is the neuron that has the nerve impulse and will release the neurotransmitters. We also have a postsynaptic neuron. Post means after, and so the postsynaptic neuron is located after the synapse, and it receives and binds to those neurotransmitters. So here's an animation showing how the presynaptic neuron, using vesicles, will release the neurotransmitters into the synapse, and then those neurotransmitters are taken up by the postsynaptic neuron. And then the postsynaptic neuron gets that nerve impulse, gets the action potential, gets the message that the neuron was trying to send. After the impulse is passed, neurotransmitters must clear out of the synapse. And so there's 2 ways that this could happen. These neurotransmitters could be recycled, meaning the presynaptic neuron could take them up again, repackage them, and be ready to use them again the next time it has to send an impulse. Or they could be broken down. There could be structures within the body that can clear out and destroy those leftover neurotransmitters. So here's just an example of all of the different structures involved when neurotransmitters are transmitting messages. Here are just some examples of neurotransmitters that our body uses: adrenaline, noradrenaline, dopamine, serotonin, GABA, acetylcholine, glutamate, endorphins. All of those are different neurotransmitters that are released in different situations. Each neurotransmitter carries a different message and plays a unique role in creating an individual's brain chemistry. Here's an example of different neurotransmitter levels and what that can do to an individual's mood. Imbalances in neurotransmitters can contribute to mental health conditions such as anxiety and depression, as well as other issues. Research has indicated several potential causes of chemical imbalances in the brain, including too few molecules that build the neurotransmitters, not enough receptor sites on a postsynaptic neuron to receive the neurotransmitters that are released. Presynaptic neurons are taking up and recycling the neurotransmitters before they actually reach the postsynaptic neuron, or maybe too little of a specific neurotransmitter is being produced. There are a variety of causes of neurotransmitter imbalance. These are just some examples that could contribute.